and welcome to the Business Talk podcast. I'm your host Deepak. I'm delighted to invite you to join me in welcoming Professor MichaelDSmith, Professor of Information Technology and Public Policy at Heinz College and Tepper School of Business at Carnegie Mellon University. In this episode, Professor MichaelDSmith shares valuable insights from his transformative book, The Abundant University: Remaking Higher Education for a Digital World. Professor Smith holds a PhD in Management Science and Information Technology from MIT Sloan School of Business, along with MS in Telecommunications Science and BS in Electrical Engineering from the University of Maryland. His research applies economic and statistical methods to analyze firm and consumer behavior in digital markets, with work published in top academic journals and featured in the Harvard Business Review and the Sloan Management Review and press outlets including The Economist, The Wall Street Journal, The New York Times, Wired, and Business Week. Professor Smith has received several awards for his teaching, research, and writing, including the National Science Foundation's prestigious Career Research Award, the 2009 and 2004 Best Teacher Awards in Carnegie Mellon's Masters of Information Systems Management program, and the 2024 Frandson Award for Literature for The Abundant University. Professor Smith is also the co-author of the widely acclaimed book, Streaming, Sharing, Stealing, Big Data and the Future of Entertainment, published by the MIT Press. Professor Michael Smith, it is an honor and privilege to have you join us today.
Deepak, thank you for a very kind introduction. It's great to be here with you.
Professor, you argue that higher education is financially and morally unsustainable. Can you elaborate on the core reasons behind this crisis?
Sure. So the reason I'm arguing it's financially and morally unsustainable, on the financial side, what we know is that tuition at universities has increased at 4 times the rate of inflation since 1978, right? So 4 times faster than inflation. I just don't see how that's sustainable financially. On the moral side, what we know, and this is Raj Chetty's research at Harvard, what we know from the data is that kids born into the top 1% of income are 77 times more likely to gain admission to an elite, top 50 or so selective school. 77 times more likely than kids born into the bottom 20% of income. I just don't see how that's morally sustainable. Right? The only way that makes sense is if we in higher education believe that kids born into the top 1% are 77 times more likely to be capable of an elite education than kids born in the bottom 20%. And I don't know anyone who believes that. So there's something really screwed up about our prices, and there's something really screwed up about our selection.
How is the scarcity-based model of enrollment, instruction, and credentialing contributed to social injustice and economic stratification?
Great. So this is a nice follow-up question to the first one, right? No one in higher education wants that to be our outcome, and yet that is our outcome consistently. So what's going on here? I would argue, and we can expand on this, I would argue that these outcomes we're seeing are systemic problems. That means they are inherent to the system of higher education. And because they're systemic problems, almost by definition, we're not going to change them by tweaking the existing system, right? We're not going to change them by increasing financial aid to low-income students a little bit more, although I'm perfectly in favor of that. But that's not going to solve the fundamental problem. The fundamental problem is we've got a really messed up system. One way to think about this is what we know from the data is that getting admitted to and paying the money for an elite college, even at its inflated prices, gives you a payoff in terms of the job market, right? That paying for expensive colleges is worth it in the job market. Another way of saying that is the best way to become wealthy is to gain admission to a selective school. What Raj Chetty's research says is the best way to gain admission to an elite school is to be wealthy, right? So you put those two things together, and we've got a really bad feedback loop. The best way to become wealthy is to gain admission to an elite college. The best way to gain admission to an elite college is to be wealthy. That's not the sort of feedback loop that we in higher education are should be excited about, and yet that's what the system is causing, if you will, in the marketplace.
Professor Smith, what are some historical factors that have led to the exclusivity and inefficiency of our current higher education system?
Yeah. I wish I were a better historian to reinforce to support what I'm about to say, but I've said it to enough people who are better historians that I think it's true. I think you could make a compelling argument that historically, the university was there to separate the classes, for lack of a better word, right? That if you were in the higher class, you had the money to send your kids to college, and that was a signal that you were in the upper class. And if you were in the working class, and again, I don't mean that in any sort of pejorative sense, but if you were in the working class, you didn't have the money to send your kids to a higher education school, and so you stayed. And so one way of thinking about this is that historically, 100 years ago, college was there to separate the classes. We're now asking it to do something it wasn't designed to do, that structurally it wasn't designed to do, and we're having a whole bunch of problems getting it to do this thing. What I'm arguing in the book is let's think about a different way. Let's think about ways to use the technologies we have to create a new system of higher education that is unencumbered by these legacy problems that the system we have today is exhibiting.
You advocate for digital technologies as a solution. What specific technologies do you see as the most transformative for higher education?
Yeah, great question. So the obvious ones are, I think it used to be the case that if you wanted to learn calculus, particularly Calc 3, that you needed to get admitted to a college because the only people who could teach you Calc 3 were on college campuses. That's not true anymore. There are actually a bunch of places online where you can get the skills necessary to learn Calc 3 or machine learning or a whole bunch of different advanced skills that used to be only delivered on college campuses. Let's embrace that, right? And I think we are. The big thing I think we haven't developed yet is an alternative credential, right? It's still the case that you can learn all these things in ways that aren't constrained by the college campus, but you don't have the signal to convince an employer to hire you based on those skills. Employers still generally hire based on four-year degrees or master's degrees or what have you. I'm advocating for us to create an alternative way of signaling that someone has the skills necessary to do the job that is an alternative to the existing four-year degree. Does that make sense?
Yes, perfect.
Okay.
Professor, how can digital learning platforms enhance both accessibility and quality in higher education?
Yeah. What we and we're seeing examples of this, right? If you look at what Zvi Galil did at the Georgia Tech's online Masters of Computer Science program, if you look at what Paul LeBlanc has done at Southern New Hampshire University, look at what Mike Crow is doing at Arizona State University, we're seeing places that say, we can deliver most of the education virtually, and we can maintain the quality of the education while including a whole bunch of people who otherwise would have been excluded. because they don't have the money or the time to come to our campus physically. That's pretty exciting, right? One of the key statements in Arizona State's mission statement is we judge ourselves not by who we exclude, but by who we include, right? We're not going to judge ourselves based on having a 7% selectivity in our admission process. We're going to judge ourselves based on the number of people we include and how well they do on our campus. That's a new model that I think we should get really excited about.
Professor Smith, many faculty members and institutions resist digital transformation. What are the biggest barriers and how can they be overcome?
Well, I mean, the biggest and most obvious barrier is change is hard, right? We've delivered education the way we're delivering it today, pretty over the past 100 years, pretty much unchanged, right? Little tweaks here and there. Making a big fundamental change is really hard because there are a lot of people who are used to the current system, and there are a lot of people whose job it is to protect the current system. And so it's really intimidating for those people. Change is also hard because there are going to be some winners and losers in this. And one of the big losers might be tenured faculty like me. You know, it's not obvious that we need the same number of faculty to teach online that we do to teach in person, and that's kind of scary. And there are multiple places in the book where I, I'm very transparent. That's scary, but not so scary that I'm willing to stand in the way of people who deserve access to the educational tools, not getting access to those educational tools. And I think that's where we can start to bring the establishment around by saying, there's this new thing over here that can allow us to deliver education to students who deserve it, but who are currently being excluded. Are we really going to stand in the way of that sort of progress? I hope the answer to that question is no.
Yes. How can an abundant education system better prepare students for the workforce compared to traditional models?
Yeah, great question. There's this interesting duality or tension between what we think we're delivering as educators and what our customers, the students, actually want from the education. So there was an article, and I've forgotten the author, but years ago in the Chronicle, in the Chronicle of Higher Education, there was an article titled Dismantle or Abolish, that's what it was, Abolish the Business School. Let's abolish the business school. And the argument was fairly compelling from a particular standpoint. The argument was universities should not be in the business of preparing people for the workforce per se. We should be in the business of delivering a broad liberal arts education, not necessarily preparing people for to work in finance. Okay. The problem is almost all of the students who are coming to universities so that they can get a job. So there's this tension between what we in higher education want to deliver and what the marketplace is actually demanding. One way to think about what I'm arguing is, hey, let's create a new way that people who just want to gain skills for the workforce can gain those skills. And maybe we in the university can get back to what we really want to be doing, which is delivering a broad liberal arts education independent of your workforce outcomes. That's one way to think about this. The problem is, I think everybody in higher education knows that if we do that, our market is going to shrink. And if our market shrinks, that means a lot of higher education institutions aren't going to be viable anymore.
In what ways do you see the economic incentives of universities changing if they embrace digital technologies?
Well, Here's the interesting thing. Our economic incentives as universities today are to admit rich kids. Um, and I know that sounds harsh, but I'm not pulling it out of thin air. There was a lawsuit by a group of students who felt like universities were acting as a cartel. In the lawsuit, they were able to, uh, through subpoenas, get access to emails from universities. And one of those emails from a particular university, it's not important which, has a quote from a university leader saying, "I sure hope the wealthy raise a few more smart kids." Um, and what they're saying is there's a huge fixed cost of delivering what we're doing, and we need to cover that fixed cost, but we can only do it within a small number of by admitting a small number of students. So those students have to pay a lot of money on average if we're going to cover our costs, right? If we admit too many students who can't pay full price, we can't cover our costs anymore. So that's at some level, that's the business model we're trapped in, as long as we say we can only admit a certain number of students. Um, if you expand this to a much more digitally delivered education, like the universities I talked about earlier, Georgia Tech Computer Science, ASU, Southern New Hampshire University, you can actually relax a lot of those constraints, right? I can amortize the fixed cost over a much larger number of students, and therefore I'm no longer tied to admitting rich kids as much as I was before. I think that's something we ought to be pretty excited about.
What potential unintended consequences should
Yeah.
we be mindful of when implementing large-scale digital education reforms?
It's a great question. This is the question that keeps me up at night, to be totally honest with you. Um, if you were to say in 2000, right, will the internet lead to a more educated voting population? The obvious answer is yes, of course it will, right? People have access to more information. They'll gain knowledge, and they'll be better informed citizens. In 2025, what we know is that if anything, it's gone the other direction for a variety of reasons. Um, that's what worries me. Could we make things even worse by embracing this? Um, I've heard people say, we don't want to create a two-tiered system. We don't want to create a two-tiered system where the wealthy have access to, on-campus education, and lower income students have access to the online education, which we all know is inferior, quote unquote. Um, so we don't want to create a two-tiered system. I would argue we already have a two-tiered system. The goal is not, the goal is to bring those two tiers together. And I think what I'm talking about can do that. Um, the other thing I'd argue is I don't know that I buy the assumption that online education is necessarily inferior to in-person education. Um, my experience in the classroom was online education was bad, except for the parts that were good. So we need to pay attention to both, right? It was less effective in some ways, but it was more effective in some other ways. I think we can, if we carefully design it, I think we can create something that is not necessarily inferior to what we delivered in person. And in fact, for some students, might actually be better. Um, Consider the students who just don't have time to come to a physical campus. Those people, online education is going to be better by definition. Otherwise they wouldn't have had access to education at all. So I'm encouraging us to think more broadly. And if I can be a little bit snarky about this, um, the argument that online education is inherently inferior to in-person education is a legally risky one, right? Because what it means is that during COVID, we charged the same prices for something we know that was inferior. Try to make that argument and try to defend that in court against students who paid full price for something they knew was inferior. So I think for a variety of reasons, online education, there are risks here. I want to be mindful of those risks, but I think the benefits outweigh the risks.
Professor, what are the first steps that policymakers, educators, and institutions should take to move forward this model?
Excellent question. Let's start with policymakers. Um, for policymakers, I would argue we should be investing in alternate ways for people to signal their skills to the marketplace. Today, the marketplace judges people based on where you graduated from. Maybe we can use some of these digital technologies to create a system that allows people to be evaluated on what knowledge do you have rather than where you got that knowledge, right? What knowledge do you actually have? I don't care where you got it from. Just show me that you got it. I think that could create a lot of benefits for society. It's interesting, when I talk about this, you can make a perfectly reasonable progressive argument that what I'm talking about should be advanced, right? I think you can also make a perfectly reasonable conservative argument that we are leaving behind a bunch of people who, if we included them, could productively contribute to our economy, right? That's a conservative argument, right? Like this could actually be good for overall GDP and all sorts of efficiency metrics. Let's do it. So in terms of convincing the policymakers, I think we can make a progressive argument and a conservative argument. In terms of convincing people on campuses, that's hard, right? Because if you're a top 25 school, embracing these things pose a lot of risks to your business model. Um, the only argument that I've felt really lands is the argument, are we going to be proud of ourselves 20 years from now, defending a system we know is unfair and unjust to socioeconomically disadvantaged populations? Are we going to be proud of that?
Professor Smith, my last question. For students and parents navigating today's system, what advice would you give to ensure they benefit from digital advancement in education?
Yeah, this is the hard one, right? Because the changes I'm talking about haven't really happened yet. So my advice to students and parents would be go to college. It is still the best way of becoming wealthy later on in your life. That's where my wife and I sent our three kids. And I think for most students, that today is the best path. I know students, friends who have their child has chosen an alternate path, chosen to, go around college and do more with apprenticeships to move their way up in the job market. I think those are interesting, but we still, still in the job market, you're going to be judged on whether today you're going to be judged on whether you have a four-year degree. That's the system I'm trying to change. But like I said, that's the system we're in today. And today, the best path is still a four-year degree.
Professor Michael D. Smith, it has been an absolute honor and privilege to have you join us today. Your insights into the challenges and opportunities in higher education, as explored in The Abundant University, offer a compelling vision for the future. Your work as the intersection of technology, economics, and public policy continues to shape the way we understand digital transformation in education and beyond. From your research on digital markets to your thought leadership on the future of entertainment and learning, your contributions are truly impactful. On behalf of our listeners, thank you for sharing your expertise for an engaging and thought-provoking discussions. We look forward to following your work and the important conversation that inspires. Thank you so much.
Deepak, my pleasure. Thanks for having me on the program.